My name is Daniel Morris, and I'm 28 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon. A few years ago, I worked the closing shift at a KFC on Southeast 82nd Avenue. It was a decent gig until one night turned it into a memory I wish I could forget. It was a quiet Tuesday night, and we were nearing closing time. My coworker, Jake, had left early because of a family emergency, leaving me to lock up by myself. I wasn't too concerned. It wasn't the first time I'd closed alone. By 11:30 p.m., the dining area was spotless, and the lights were dimmed. I headed to the back to finish the last bit of cleaning in the kitchen. As I scrubbed the counters, I heard a faint knock at the front door. I froze. The restaurant was clearly closed, the closed sign was hanging on the door, and all the lights in the front were off. The knock came again, louder this time. Against my better judgment, I walked toward the front and peeked through the glass. A man stood outside. He was tall, wearing a black coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. "We're closed," I called out through the door. The man didn't move or respond. He just stood there, motionless, as if he hadn't heard me. "Sorry, we're closed," I repeated, louder this time. Still nothing. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed to the door's lock. A chill ran down my spine. Something about him wasn't right. I shook my head and backed away. That's when he did something I'll never forget. He smiled. It wasn't a normal smile, it was too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face, revealing rows of yellow teeth. His head tilted slightly, and his eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to lock onto mine. I turned and bolted to the back, grabbing my phone to call the police. But as I dialed, the lights flickered, and the power cut out, plunging the entire restaurant into darkness. Come on, I muttered, frantically trying to get a signal. Then I heard it, the soft creak of the front door opening. My blood ran cold. I knew I had locked it. Footsteps echoed in the dining area, slow and deliberate. They were coming closer. I grabbed a knife from the counter and hid behind a stack of boxes in the storage room. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. "Daniel," a voice whispered. It was deep and raspy, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. How did he know my name? The door creaked open, and I held my breath. I could see the shadow of his figure stretching across the floor, impossibly tall and distorted. "Daniel," the voice called again, this time right next to me. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up, knife in hand, and swung wildly, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Suddenly, the power flickered back on. I stood there, trembling, knife still in my hand. The restaurant was silent. I ran to the front to check the door. It was locked, just as I had left it. No sign of the man, no sign of forced entry, nothing. I quit the next day and never went back. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. But every time I pass by that KFC, I can't help but feel like he's still there, waiting for someone to let him in. My name is Kevin Johnson, and I'm 34 years old. I live in Jacksonville, Florida. This happened on a humid summer night earlier this year at the KFC on Atlantic Boulevard. I had been driving back from a late-night meeting and decided to stop for a quick bite. It was close to 1 a.m., and the road was practically deserted. The KFC, with its brightly lit sign and promise of comfort food, seemed like the perfect pit stop. When I walked in, the first thing I noticed was how empty it was. No other customers, no chatter, just silence. Behind the counter stood a young man, probably in his early 20s, with a name tag that read Ryan. He gave me a strained nod. welcome to KFC. What can I get you? He asked in a flat tone, like someone who had been working too many hours. I'll take a bucket meal, original recipe, I said. He nodded, punched in the order, and said, it'll be just a moment. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the kitchen. I sat down at a table, scrolling through my phone while I waited. As the minutes ticked by, I started to feel uneasy. The silence in the restaurant was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. After 10 minutes, I went up to the counter. Hello? Ryan? No response. I leaned over the counter, trying to see into the kitchen, but it was too dark. Just then, the lights flickered, and a faint metallic smell hit my nose. It was sharp and unsettling, like rust mixed with something sickly sweet. Ryan? I called out again, louder this time. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural moan coming from the kitchen. It sent chills down my spine. Against my better judgment, I pushed open the kitchen door. The sight that greeted me will haunt me forever. The kitchen was a mess. Raw chicken parts were strewn across the counters, but they weren't still, they were twitching. Blood smeared the walls, and the fryer hissed as if something was trapped inside it. In the corner, Ryan was crouched on the floor, his back to me. His uniform was soaked in something dark, and his body shook violently. Ryan, are you okay? I whispered, terrified but unable to look away. He turned his head slowly, and what I saw was inhuman. His eyes were black, completely devoid of whites, and his mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing jagged teeth that glistened in the dim light. He let out a guttural scream and started crawling toward me, his movements unnatural and jerky. I stumbled back, crashing into a rack of trays, and ran for the exit. As I burst out of the restaurant and into the humid night, I didn't dare look back. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and sped off. When I finally got home, I couldn't shake the image of Ryan's distorted face. The next day, I drove past the KFC to see if it was open, but the building was abandoned. The sign had been removed, and the windows were boarded up as if it had been closed for years. I still don't know what I encountered that night, but I haven't set foot in a KFC or any fast food place since. My name is Brandon Moore, and I'm 28 years old. A few years ago, I worked at a KFC in Casper, Wyoming. It was a quiet town, and the KFC wasn't particularly busy, especially during night shifts. But something happened one evening that still makes my skin crawl. It was a Wednesday, and I was the only one scheduled to close the store. My coworkers had left around 10 p.m., and I stayed behind to finish mopping the floors and shutting everything down. The place was silent except for the faint hum of the kitchen appliances. As I worked, I couldn't help but notice the large, old-fashioned clock hanging on the wall near the dining area. It was one of those oversized decorative clocks with Roman numerals, something the owner thought added a rustic charm to the place. That night, the clock seemed off. It was ticking, but the hands weren't moving. At first, I thought it might have just stopped working, but as I stared at it, I realized the hands were twitching slightly, as if trying to move but stuck. I shook my head and went back to cleaning, figuring it was just a mechanical issue. A few minutes later, though, I heard a strange noise. Tick. 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 It wasn't coming from the clock, it was louder, closer, like it was coming from behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped. I decided to ignore it and continued mopping, but as I moved closer to the clock, I noticed something else. The glass covering the clock face had a smudge on it, like someone had pressed their hand against it. That didn't make sense. I had cleaned the clock just a few hours earlier, and no one had touched it since. I walked over to wipe it off, but as I raised my hand, the ticking sound returned, louder this time, echoing through the empty restaurant. Then, the clock's hands began to move. Not forward, like a normal clock, but backward. Slowly at first, then faster, spinning wildly as the ticking grew deafening. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and that's when I heard it. A faint voice, whispering. It wasn't clear at first, but as I strained to listen, I could make out the words. "Don't leave, stay with me." I froze. The voice sounded close, almost like it was coming from inside the clock. Suddenly, the glass face of the clock cracked, a jagged line spreading across it like a spiderweb. I backed away, my breathing shaky, and grabbed my bag. I wasn't sticking around to find out what was going on. As I headed for the door, the ticking stopped abruptly. The silence was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Before I could leave, the clock fell off the wall with a loud crash. The glass shattered, and the wooden frame split open. I glanced back, and my blood ran cold. Inside the broken clock was something I'll never forget, a small, faded photograph of a man in an old KFC uniform, his face twisted into a haunting grin. Scribbled across the back of the photo were the words, "Time's up." I didn't wait another second. I bolted out of the restaurant, leaving the lights on and the doors unlocked. The next morning, I told my manager what had happened. He brushed it off, saying the clock had been acting weird for years and that it was probably just old wiring. But no one could explain the photo. I quit the following week. I still don't know who the man in the photo was or why the clock seemed to come alive that night. But every now and then, when I hear the ticking of a clock, I'm reminded of that haunting grin and the words I can never forget. Time's up.